Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the OT Lifestyle Movement. I'm Rhiannon Crisp, occupational therapist, personal trainer, and founder of OTLifestyleMovement.com. Today, we are talking all about sensory processing with the one and only Professor Winnie Dunn. What an absolute honor and privilege it is to be speaking with a legendary OT like Winnie. Professor Winnie Dunn is a true visionary in the world of OT, whose career-long commitment to learning has propelled our profession forward. Winnie is internationally known expert for her studies on sensory processing in everyday life. She has published more than 100 research articles, book chapters, and books, and has spoken around the globe shedding light on sensory processing. She is the author of The Sensory Profile Measure and the book Living Sensationally, Understanding Your Senses Living Sensationally. She's an absolute inspiration of mine, and welcome, Winnie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It is, honestly, I'm so excited to have you with us. Before we dive into sensory processing and all the questions that I have lined up for you, I'd love it if we could hit the rewind button and find out a bit about your OT journey and how you came to do the work that you're doing today.
It was interesting this very morning. Last week, I found out that there's a program here in town called Camp Encourage, which is a summer camp for kids who have autism. And they're I have a history with them. They're not very old, but they're very enthusiastic, and it's very exciting. So I was doing a little video for them, and they were asking a similar question. And I remembered that when I was in college, I worked at a summer camp called Camp Daniel Boone, and it was for children with like cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus and hemophilia. And I think, when I think back, that was a pretty pivotal experience for me. I was in a natural environment. We were figuring out whatever adaptations we had to do so these children had an authentic camping experience. The fires, the campfire singing, and throwing the sticks in, swimming, hiking, all the things that anybody would do at a camp. And so this Camp Encourage made me remember that was like a beginning experience where I was around other people trying to problem solve and like giving like pure joy to these children. They would go home all beat up, and their parents would come get them after a week, and they would just be so happy, and they would look, like a wreck because they had done all these great things. And so, that is probably where all of this started, this idea that we can be helpful to others who have different ways of living. And there was no restraint there. There was no rules about what the funders would pay for or what none of that was part of it. It was just this pure joy of being in a context of nature that everybody loves. And so that is, to me, that is what I realized this very day, was the seed that started to grow. And so when I started looking around, I was in a dorm in college with these two women. They were a little bit older, but they were living in the dorm, and they had started out in fashion design and changed their minds and decided to be physical therapists. And they were just a hoot. And those very 2 years that I was living with them, the OT program at that university was starting, and they kept coming back from class and saying, you've got to go to the OT program. You've got to go to the OT program, because I had this big humpback trunk with all these like hammers and sewing supplies and crafts, and I was always fixing things or making things. And so it's like I had all these like early experiences that today I can look back and go, oh yeah, that was putting it all together. But I didn't, I think none of us really realize it going forward, that that's contributing and that's contributing. So those were my really early experiences. And then when I was on one of my field works, I was placed at a school for children with different disabilities, because back then children were segregated in their schooling. And I was with this bunch of men and women, these teachers and therapists that were radical, like, and this is a long time ago. So they were like sneaking signs to children because we weren't supposed to teach sign language because, you know, they thought children wouldn't talk if you did that, you know. But that was another incident where I learned how to question the status quo. You know, like, is that really the right thing to be doing? You know, this child's getting frustrated. What's a way we could work our way through that? You know, they didn't take no for an answer. They just were going to figure out a way to make it work for that kid. So in my early years, I had all these experiences with people that were like, on no uncertain terms, doing whatever it takes. So imagine then when I get into OT school and I have, you know, I learn all the principles and all the sort of rules and, you know, the philosophy and the sort of core values of OT. But I have this background from all these other people telling me that we can figure out new ways to do things. And when I look back on my career, I would say, you know, my first job was in a public school 5 years before the federal government in the United States had a rule that OTs had to be in public schools, because the state I live in had started it early. I did my PhD program. I was one of the experimental students. They were trying to get a new program started, so I was one of the experimental students that did that with them. You know, I have this whole life of being in places where I'm proud to say I was willing to try something new. And that spirit of adventure and that ability to see the joy of a person being able to live the life they want to live, separate from being an OT, but having that core value has really, I think, been a thread that you can follow through my whole career. So.
And this is what I absolutely love about you, Winnie, is that you do question the status quo and you aren't afraid to bring up new ideas. And I think this is so important to move our profession forward, is to come up with new ideas and question things and be curious.
Mm-hmm. Curious is a really important word. When I got my, a couple years, it's probably about 4 years ago now, when I got my positive psychology certification to be a positive psychology coach, I actually still have a little sticker on my computer here that says "Stay curious," because one of the things that I learned in there is that this idea that we already know the answer that a person's going to have is just erroneous. And this idea that if you can stay curious with the families you're serving or with the teachers you're serving or with the adults you're serving, you find out so many more things about them, you know? So I'm really glad that you said the word before me.
Well, that's it. You know, we all have these set of lenses through which we view the world. And even us as therapists, we have this based on our experiences and how we grew up and what we watch on television and the information that we get day to day. But we've got to understand that our clients too have their own set of lenses through which they view the world. And we need to start to understand their belief systems and their values and what's meaningful to them.
And that isn't that what makes being an OT so interesting? You know, like, we don't have, the only protocol we have is to visit this other person's life and find out about it. You know, like, how much more intimate can you get than that your first job is to find out what their life is like? Like, no wonder we never get tired of being an OT.
I know, it's an absolutely incredible profession, and that's it. And I still think as a profession too, we have a long way to go. There's so many things left unexplored, and I could speak to you about this forever, but I suppose we should get into the sensory processing side of things. But when I started thinking of all the things that I'd like to talk to you about, there were so many different things. There was, a strengths-based approach, there was coaching, and there was sensory processing. So we will dive into the sensory processing today, but we might even have to get you back on for another chat another day.
Oh, that would be fine.
So what was it about sensory processing that led you on this career-long journey to studying it? Can you share your fascination with us?
Well, when I was a young OT, was when Dr. Ayers was, she started working on her ideas. She was writing about it. And in the very early years of my career was when she created the Southern California Sensory Integration Test, which was her first big evaluation tool. And she and three of her friends were spending their weekends doing workshops teaching people about this. And, I think they thought it would just be this little thing and they would teach people, but it became enormous really fast. And these women were just overwhelmed with how much interest OTs had in this idea. There's something about the people that pick OT that makes sensory processing really fascinating to us. And they asked for people to join them to apply to be a person that would teach about the core ways of doing this test. And this is when you're young, you do things that when you're older, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. But I applied. And I think, there weren't as many OTs back then. So, they picked me. And so that was the sort of formal start of my journey. But the thing that I have come to understand is that this is such an essential piece of who each of us are. Sometimes when people have a hard time with the ideas, it's because we all experience sensation all the time. It's why we make an adjustment in our chairs. It's why we pick certain foods. It's why we, reject a kind of clothing or accept another kind of clothing. But it's so much part of that everyday experience that we forget. In fact, most of us aren't even aware that that's what's driving a lot of those decisions. And that's part of what Dr. Ayers talked about at the beginning was the children having a different reaction to the things that other people weren't noticing, or that other people were reacting a different way. So my fascination was really this idea that I could be part of helping grow people's knowledge about this. I was curious as a young therapist. I was working in a public school, and children in public school is like their everyday environment. It's like life for children. And if you were in X teacher's classroom or Y teacher's classroom, you had a very different experience because of how the teacher organized it. And so my awareness about the impact of these things that I now understand to be sensory experiences was really early, because I was working with kindergartners, and they're loud and rowdy and they don't know the rules, and that sort of disarray affected the children very differently.
So how do you describe sensory processing today? Because I'm sure your understanding of it has developed over the years. How do you describe it?
For me, it's the from a neuroscience standpoint, because I have a degree in neuroscience, it's the information your brain needs to organize things, to make decisions, to decide what to do, to decide what changes a person needs to make. Without sensory input, your brain is starved. In the early 70s, the studies about the sensory deprivation tanks that people would get into, it wasn't even 10 minutes before the brain started creating sensation. When they took it all away, when they took gravity away and light away, and they made however the saline was, you couldn't feel the sensation on your skin. The brain started creating it. So this idea. So from a neuroscience standpoint, it's the food, it's the fodder that your body and brain need to decide what to do. From a person-oriented point of view, sensory processing is the thing that that guides how we organize our day, what we make decisions to do, how we figure out how we're interested in something. Um, it helps us develop competency. Sensory processing is the material out of which we create our lives. And so that's why, to me, knowing what sensory processing is for each person is so critical. It evolves into their temperament. You know, we've seen studies where there's a really strong relationship between certain temperaments and certain patterns of sensory processing. So even the way that we present ourselves to other people is based on how our senses are noticing and responding to things in the everyday environment.
Hmm. And you describe 4 sensory patterns. Can you briefly describe what they are?
Yeah. Um, I'm so proud that I figured it out because I didn't understand it at first. You know, at first I thought it would just be auditory and visual and touch, you know. And so imagine my shock when the first studies I did clustered things from different sensory systems together. It kind of upset me, if you want to know the truth. Um, there was a bigger truth there that I couldn't understand. So from all these studies from thousands of people, what we figured out is that the brain certainly responds to our sensory categories of touch and motion and visual and auditory. But at a sort of meta level, the brain is responding to 2 really important things. One is the thresholds from a neuroscience standpoint, the neurological thresholds, like how fast or slow does your brain respond to sensation. So if you have high thresholds, it means it takes a whole lot of input, and if you have low, it takes very little. And then crisscross with that is a psychological feature, which is your self-regulation, which is whether you actively do things to control your sensation or you sort of let stuff happen and then react to it. So when you do that, you get these 4 patterns. And so seeking is the first pattern, and it is people with really high thresholds whose brains are interested in having more sensation. And so the brain does things to make you notice and get interested in all the sensations around you. Seekers have high thresholds, so they're going after sensation. People that touch all the fabrics when they're shopping in a clothing store, or they're tasting all the food and they want you to taste it when you're having dinner together. These are people that really take a lot of pleasure in sensation, and they think because they do, all the rest of us do too, even if we don't. They're just like generators of sensation. They dance, kids at school hop instead of walk. They do things to make more sensation for themselves throughout the day. Avoiders also have that really sort of active strategy of going after things, but they have really low sensory thresholds, so their brains are triggered by tiny little amounts of sensory input, and their brain reacts as if it's potentially dangerous or harmful. So their behavioral reactions are more about withdrawing, about staying away, about not engaging. A child or an adult with an avoiding pattern might also have a little temper tantrum, but it's to like get you to stop, to get you to quit doing whatever it is, like making a noise or doing something that is too much for their nervous system. So avoiders are, they're very self-contained, and their active strategy is to stop it or get away from it. The third pattern are sensors. Sensors also have low thresholds, but they, because of the self-regulation continuum, they're more likely to let things happen to them and then react. So they can get overwhelmed really fast because they're trying to engage, but they also can be really bossy. Like, could you stop chewing that gum? Could you quit hitting your plate with your fork? Could you, and they might be really picky at a restaurant, sending food back because it's not the right temperature, because their brain is very discerning about every little detail. I always tell families that kids that are sensors are the emotional barometers of their family, because they're the first one that notices if your mood changes. What's wrong, mommy? They detect those little bitty changes, so they're very dear to have around because they're so in tune with other people around them. But that can be overwhelming. And then the fourth category I call bystanders. It's registration is the formal name. But these are people that have really high thresholds like seekers, but they do not do things to give themselves more. So their appearance is very easygoing, but they can miss cues. Like a parent. I've had people say to me, "Can you help me? My husband, is a bystander." It's like, well, if you want him to notice what the children are doing, they're going to have to be in the same room together, and they're going to have to throw the ball across his lap for him to notice. Like, bystanders just don't detect very quickly. They're oblivious sometimes, which I think is good. We can learn a lesson from them. They don't get too riled up about stuff, but they also can miss things that are important. So bystanders have to have like external cues around them to remind them about things, because they can easily forget. So they all have, just to be clear, they all have really good qualities, and they all have really challenging qualities. It's not a diagnosis to be fixed. It's just a characteristic to understand.
I love that. And depending on the context too that we're in, these patterns change.
Well, and avoiders create contexts that don't challenge their sensory systems. They might pull the shades down in their house, or they might not have very many things on the wall, because that is a more settling, calming, organizing kind of environment for them. Seekers might have 50 things on their walls, because that extra input is really helpful to them. So we all have an intuition about it, but I think the cool thing about as an OT is that we can share this gift with families and with teachers and with husbands and wives and grandparents about what these behaviors mean, so that they feel kind of in charge of it instead of like blown over by it. If a family understands that a child is an avoider, mom or dad taking that kid out to the other room for a few minutes is just so he can regroup, not because he's difficult. It sort of changes the language that we use. And my husband is a bystander, and so he, of course, throws that in my face sometimes. You realize I'm a bystander, and somebody famous wrote about that. Like, give me a break. But as a seeker, he doesn't notice how irritating I might be, because he doesn't notice all the things. So that balancing of understanding what the characteristic is and how it shows up in the everyday life is a really important part. If you understand your child's sensitive, you don't take offense if they have enough of you hugging them. You don't feel like a bad mother because that happened. You're like, I'm so glad that he knows when he has enough, and I can be respectful of that. And it just changes the dynamics of the relationships when you understand those things.
Absolutely. And we can bring so much more empathy when we understand why people do the things they do. I want to read an excerpt from an article, Winnie, that you wrote back in 2001. And it was titled, "The Sensations of Everyday Life, Empirical, Theoretical, and Pragmatic Considerations." The experience of being human is embedded in the sensory events of everyday life. When we observe how people live their lives, we discover that they characterize their experiences from a sensory point of view. Sensation is the common language by which we share the experience of being human. It provides a common ground for understanding. Can you unpack this a little bit more for us?
As I told you earlier, I'm so happy that I understood that long ago, this idea that it's part of the humanity that we have. I think that since sensation drives all of the things that our brain does, we take it for granted, or we don't notice it. And if someone is telling you a story about something that happened to them. They're using sensory words. They're telling you about whether it was so bright they couldn't see, or whether they had this these pants on that were too tight. Like they're hearkening words that make you have a vicarious sensory experience with them. And that's how we sort of paint our world for each other. And I think if we understand that that's a fundamental part of being a human being, then we stop making sensory processing a dysfunction or a deficit, and we start making it a characteristic that even though like kids with autism or adults with schizophrenia might have a more intense version of the experiences we have, we're all on the same continuum. It's not a pathology anymore. It's a way of knowing. It's a way of deriving meaning. And if we listen to each other from that standpoint, I think that, like you said earlier, the empathy and compassion for what it feels like to be inside that other person's skin, or what it feels like to be the parent of a child that's having those experiences, helps us to be more present with the sort of the considerable gifts we have as OTs to solve the problem with the family or with the teacher. Like, what do you want it to look like, and how can we get there from here? If you listen with that idea that it's part of all of our humanity.
I want to read another excerpt from that same article, because you touched on that just then, and I want to dive a little bit deeper. You say sensory processing patterns are reflections of who we are. These patterns are not a pathology that needs fixing. Intervention addresses the interference between our desired life and our current performance. Sensory processing knowledge can narrow this gap and reduce interference, thereby affording a satisfying life. And then you go on to say, therapeutic intervention is only appropriate when there is something the person wants or needs to do, and their way of sensory processing interferes with that aspect of living a satisfying life. I love this. Can you break this apart a little bit more for us?
That I still love it. For me, there have been studies. We've known about sensory processing and these patterns for a long enough time now that we have studies across time, and studies with adults. For example, there's a study with adults who have autism, and I've read a lot of autobiographies in America we would say they are self-advocates that tell about their experience as people with autism and the things that their parents did, their therapists did. They tell us all that. So when we look at those kinds of pieces of evidence, what we see is that people have the same patterns of sensory processing when they grow up as they had when they were children. They certainly have a different repertoire of behaviors. They might have decided that something was really important, like a teenager that says, jeans are really scratchy, but everybody's wearing jeans. I'm gonna wear those jeans. They might have to like get home and relax quietly for a while after wearing them, but they may, we still have the ability to make those decisions for ourselves. But the evidence is that people still have their basic sensory patterns their whole life. So if that's true, and you and I have the ability to figure out what a person's sensory patterns are from like interviewing and observing their life and doing assessments like the sensory profile, then what we have are all the tools we need to provide really effective and satisfying interventions that lead to their satisfying life. So I always ask people about what it is, like, tell me about a time that, when things go really smoothly, what does it look like? And tell me about this thing that you want to do, and what makes it hard for you, so that we can and then I keep linking it back to what their sensory patterns are. Did you notice that the place that was really easy for you is really quiet, and this activity you want to do is in a really noisy place, so you're sensitive to sound, so I wonder what we could do about that. So that I keep linking back to what their sensory patterns are, but we stay focused on the activity of interest or the setting of interest or the thing they want to learn or achieve or do. And by linking it back to sensory processing, I give them the tools not to judge themselves. I'm too sensitive, or if I wasn't so picky, but to say, how can I make this setting, this activity acceptable? Like, can I put earphones in? Can I stand at the perimeter instead of in the middle? It gives us tools to either adapt the environment or change the components of the activity so the person can still do it. Like a good example is I was helping somebody with going to a concert. And, all of us go to concerts, but we do it in a different way. If you're a seeker, you go early, you talk about it the whole week before, you go out after, you're singing all the songs, you're in the mosh pit. Like, that's the seeker's experience. But an avoider or a sensor might buy tickets on the balcony on the first row so people can't bump into them. They might get there early to get to their seat. They might either leave early or wait and leave later. They're going to rest before they go to the concert. So helping people understand this this relationship between what my body is like and what the demands of this thing are that I want to do, and how to sort of broker those things. To me, OTs are standing in the space. We're looking at the activity, we're looking at the person, and we're saying, how we can shift this part over here, we can shift this part over here. So we're helping that person like navigate alternatives so that the sensory pattern they have doesn't interfere anymore. It's still there. They're still sensitive to sound or whatever, but it's not a deal breaker anymore because they understand the nature of it. Like, they might have to get up during the concert and go out in the hall for a while, go get the drinks for everyone so that they have a break from the loudness. But they're still having the experience on their own terms. They're not saying I can't do that because I have low thresholds. They're just saying, here's how it's going to have to look for me to do it. And so as we provide intervention that way, we also build the parent, the person, the child, the teacher's competence. We build their ability to notice how that person's sensory patterns are affecting what the activity outcomes are. And to me, that's like the best kind of OT ever.
Can you explain why? And I feel like this weaves into the coaching a little bit, where we're helping the client solve their own meaningful problems rather than coming up with the solutions ourselves and feeling like we are the expert and we're on this pedestal. It's more of a participation. It's more of a partnership with them.
Well, I have, my degrees are in 3 different disciplines. So I've had this value my whole life of what have other people figured out, or what are other people thinking about this? So there's a lot of coaching research in business, in executive work, in social work. And then paired with that, there's a lot of education evidence about the need for people to be engaged. Like, the old idea that we would lecture doesn't really it doesn't foster learning. It doesn't foster deep understanding and learning, but that engagement does. So if you take those 2 things together, what we know about human beings is that when they have to dig in and figure things out, number one, it'll be a better match for them because they'll only think of things that they're interested in doing. But secondly, the act of having to dig in, try things, see what works, see what doesn't work, keeps their brain deeply involved in what the solution's going to be. So then they're more likely to actually do it. I certainly in my career, I've given families and teachers things, and then I would go back and they'd be like, yeah, that was fine, and you knew they didn't do it. Like, it was a perfect plan, but plans that no one does aren't actually plans. And so this idea of engaging the other person and trusting that they can think of something. I know you can think of it. And as OTs, being willing to let them try things that we are pretty confident aren't going to work. We always trying to protect people from errors, but errors are the places where we go, it's because of this, I got to tweak it. I had a mom that wanted her younger son who had autism to go to the baseball games to watch the older brother play. Well, he was sensitive to sound and touch, like on the bleachers, like it is it's a haven for those two things. And so guess what he did? He ran away. And it took us a while. She tried headphones. And then she realized the headphones were bothering him from a touch standpoint. But she kind of worked her way through 5 or 6 different strategies. And I totally love what she ended up doing. So one night she was just frustrated because her older son was mad because he never saw the game. She never saw what he did. And so out of desperation, she got a babysitter for the younger boy, just so that her older son could see that she was going to really watch his game. And she tells me the next time we talked, she says, Winnie, it was the first time the 3 of us had dinner together because we weren't all mad. My son was mad that I didn't watch his game. My other son was mad because he was overwhelmed. She said, I just realized that that baseball diamond is never going to be easy for my younger son. It's just never going to be an easy place. And he was so relaxed from being able to be in a quiet place on his own terms that actually family time was what we did after we all went and did the things that were good for us. And then we came back together. So she went through this process of continuing to return back to, he's sensitive to sound. The headphones didn't work. She moved on the bleachers and everybody moved up to say hi. It didn't help. But they were all great ideas, and they were all ideas that reflected her understanding of what her son needed, and that sort of grittiness of like honing the idea and honing the idea and honing the idea is what made it. If I had just said to her, get a babysitter, do you see how, like, she would have thought, you don't get that I want to have family time. Like, she didn't, being present with her until she figured out what family time really was going to look like, also deepened her commitment to finding the way. And to me, that's where, like, sensory processing knowledge and coaching are a really good pair, because continuing to remind her, like, it's really noisy, so what can we do about the noise? What do you have control over? What don't you have control over? Those conversations helped her to sort of come to this new place. And then, the babysitting wasn't a resentful thing. It was like, oh my God, I'm totally honoring what this little boy needs. I'm being a better mother by giving him the babysitter. Like, she really understood it deep in her bones. She wasn't like pawning him off anymore. She was giving him what he needed. And, it made her feel like a better parent for making that choice instead of like she was dumping him off. But that wouldn't have happened if I had just said, get a babysitter. That's never going to work at the baseball game.
I love that example. I love that. I love that example. And I think I've written down a few points that I want to touch on, because this is what I got out of it, that it is about asking the right questions. We're not always there to give the answers. It's about asking the right questions so they can come to the realization and to the strategies themselves. And how powerful it is for the parent or for the client to be able to be their own change agent, to be able to be the driver in their own life. Because when another situation happens again, they can start to problem solve for themselves. They don't need to come running to therapy to ask someone to solve their problem. They are active and solving their own meaningful problems. And this is what it's all about. It's about empowering people to live their life on their terms with their own problem solving skills.
Right. In one of our studies that we did, one of the moms and dads we would meet with them pretty regularly. And then, sometimes the parents would say, can we just have a few weeks? We understand the basic things. Can we just have a few weeks to try some things, And this one mom and dad, they would say to each other, what would Lauren ask us next about the therapist? Because they understood that what we're giving them is this scaffolding of how to solve it, and what a better way for a teacher or a parent to feel competent than to give them a strategy to not be overwhelmed or to judge the behavior, but to say, so what did that behavior tell me and what should I do next? Like that's, if a parent's problem solving, like you said, is to say, call the therapist, like we haven't done the work that we've promised that we would do. Absolutely not.
I'd love to ask you what the current evidence is that supports the concept of applying sensory processing knowledge as part of our OT interventions.
Well, there's a lot of controversy about that, especially here in America. I am certainly of the mind that using this as a tool to help families or teachers or people solve it rather than trying to fix it. I think that over the years, one of the things I've learned as a therapist is that when we keep acting like we're going to fix something, we're sending a message that there's something wrong with themselves, their parents, their children. And that's a really, I had a mom one time at a conference get really emotional because I was trying to teach about writing strength-based statements about children. And I put up a bad one and we were gonna work on it. And she said, they wrote that about my daughter. They wrote almost the same sentences about my daughter. She said, they don't even know her. And her voice is in my head, and so this idea that that we would have the audacity to suggest that a person isn't exactly how they're supposed to be, it's just unacceptable anymore. And so it doesn't mean we don't have things we want to work on or things that we want to do better. We all do, but that there should be no judgment about what a person presents with today. And so that sort of drives my decision making about interventions. And the evidence about that comes from, if you look in early childhood literature, from Carl Dunst, and he worked a lot with families in early childhood programs. It comes from a lot of the coaching literature, comes from the education literature. There was a guy that did a group of people that did a series of studies with teachers, and they they went to a workshop. I mean, the classic thing that professionals do, go to a workshop, learn a new thing, like, oh, we're all excited. We went to a workshop and everything's better. So they did a series of things. And in the first condition, they went to the workshop, they went back, they checked back with these teachers 6 months later, and like 6% of the teachers had changed their practices. So then they just kept doing progressively different things. So they would do the workshop, and then they would have a phone call, or they would do the workshop, and then they did all these different permutations of professional development. And it stayed like below 10% of the people changing their practices until the condition where they went, because we do have to learn the new things. We do have to learn them. But then each teacher that came was either in a little small cohort or had what we today would call a coach. Somebody that would come to their classroom, ask what they wanted to work on, and giving them feedback about their lesson plan, about the questions they asked their students, about the homework. When they did that as a follow-up to teaching a new thing, it jumped to 86% of the teachers changing their practices. So I know we're not exactly like teachers, but we're professionals that have a body of knowledge that we're trying to apply. I think the parallels are pretty clear, at least to me. It seems reasonable for us to hypothesize that for OTs it would be the same. If we just learn something on a weekend, we get all jazzed up. The teacher was really fun, really smart, blah, blah, blah. If we don't have a way to create accountability for ourselves, like a partner that's going to check in with us based on a goal that we've set to change how we write our notes, or how we have a conversation with a teacher, or whether how we're gonna bring up sensory processing in a conversation with a family. Any goal that we set, if we don't have an accountability partner to make us know, oh my God, I have a call on Wednesday, I better, get going on that. And to have that practice on the exact therapy process that we're doing, not an abstract one, but ours. We can't expect that people are going to be changing what they do. So if that's true for teachers, and I think it's probably true for therapists, we're all human beings, it's probably likely true for parents and for the therapist-teacher relationship, or with our relationship with the other adults that we're serving. So this idea, it goes back to the idea of engagement. And so the literature on that is really strong. And that's what rather than narrowing to just the literature on OT and, this, because some of our coaching studies, we use sensory processing as our frame of reference. I think we should start, we're getting to be a mature discipline. We got to look bigger at the evidence and see how it applies to us. When we started, we pulled on psychology, we pulled on business, we pulled on economics, we pulled on sociology. Why did we stop doing that? Just because we have our own body of work. We still have that responsibility to look at what all the evidence tells us about how to behave.
I love that. Before we start to wrap things up, I'd love to know what your top 5 tips would be for OTs who are working with clients in this sensory processing space.
The very first thing is, obviously we have to find out what a person's sensory patterns are. But then I want therapists to think about what's good about that sensory pattern. Instead of, when I was trained, it was always like, find out what's wrong and fix it, but to pause and say, what would be something really useful about that sensory pattern? Like the mom that I talked about, I had a mom with a toddler that was very, very sensitive to sound. And she had done all kinds of really good things. And like she put a white noise machine in his bedroom, and she'd done lots of really cool things. And I could see she wasn't buying it, So I said, let me tell you about the children I know that have grown up that are like your son. And I started telling her, they notice your moods. Many of them become artists because they see parts of the world that we miss, and they show it in their art, and it makes us all so happy. But they noticed it, we didn't, And she started crying, and she started telling me, she said, I'm an artist. And some of the things that she'd done for her boy, she had done as a child herself. And so that idea that there's a good thing about every sensory pattern, like they know how to have solitude, or they know how to, their joy looks like this. So to pause and be curious about what it is that's good about it, that we can tell the families or the teachers or whoever, what's good about that sensory pattern? Who are some adults we know that are successful, that have that sensory pattern, so that it doesn't look aberrant anymore? I think the second thing is to make sure as OTs that we stay focused on the person's life. I think sometimes we do have to spend some time like understanding our theories and our approach and everything, but we get so stuck there that we forget there's a life over here we're supposed to be affecting. And so the next thing would be to really stay focused on the life ahead of you, in front of you, not on your procedures. It's really not OT if you're not thinking about the other person's life. Always circling back to that. How does it affect their life? And from a sensory processing standpoint, I try to find easy and hard places during their day so that we can find out what they're, because most of the time people have some strategies. They just don't know that they're strategies. They're just like, the mom's just trying to get through the day, but her way of trying to get through the day is a really good strategy that we could harvest and use over here. So listening to what's good about their day and what does a good day look like, or what would it look like if it was perfect, taking time to find out those things so that you can say, did you notice in that story that you did this? And I think we could use that same idea over here for feeding, to like let them know that you're so competent, you thought of that. That is amazing that you figured that out. Let's use it again. That idea that their life has all the information we need. And the other thing is, for me, is that OTs need to trust themselves, that instead of thinking we have to have protocols, we need to trust that no matter what a person says about their life, if they say they tie flies, if they say they play the piano, whatever it is, that we have the considerable knowledge and skills of OT to see the therapeutic possibilities in that activity. That we don't have to worry, like I don't have to play the piano to know how to use piano playing in a therapeutic way for a particular individual. And I think that OTs forget that. We get so worried, that we're not going to do it right, that we want to cling to the 5 things that we already know how to do. And our ability to problem solve is what we go to school for all these years. So, and it's way more fun. So those would be the things that I would say to someone.
Awesome. I love it. And I love that, what you said at the end there, because we can be working with the client in the real life context of their day-to-day life and weaving in our therapeutic knowledge and everything like that to support them to do the meaningful activities that they want to do on a daily basis. So it is getting back to the core of OT. It's about participation, engagement, and quality of life, and helping people do the things that they want to do. So spot on. I love it. Oh, I probably have 1,000,001 other questions for you, Winnie, but I will head to the rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So we've got 3. And the first one is, in one sentence, how do you describe OT?
OT is a discipline that cares about what your life looks like and what makes it satisfying. And we have the tools to help you figure out how to make the things you want to do the best they can be.
Love it. Number 2, what's one healthy lifestyle habit listeners can implement today?
Staying curious and trusting that their life is unfolding as it should. Everything that happened, the bad things, the hard things, they all got us to here. And the only bad outcome is if you don't gain insight from what goes on around you. So that curiosity about, why did that happen? What does it mean? Do I want to do more of that, or do I want to change it? You get to choose all the range, but staying curious instead of judgmental changes the game a lot.
I love that. Number 3, if you could only offer one piece of advice to OTs, what would it be?
Keep your focus on the life. And I would go so far as to say that if you're not doing that, if you're procedurally focused or person factor focused, you're not doing OT. Like, the only thing that matters in OT is that their life gets better. If their balance gets better and they still can't get on the bus, we haven't done our job. We haven't done our work. So stay focused on the life that you're serving.
Love that. Thank you so much, Winnie. I am so grateful for your work, for this conversation today. You are a true trailblazer in the world of OT, and I'm deeply grateful that we can share this conversation with more OTs around the globe. And I trust that the seeds that were planted here today will grow. So thank you.
I'm so grateful you had this with me, because it was just so much fun. I don't get to think about these things all the time, and you gave me a chance to do that. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Winnie.